critics of post-war society, not everybody viewed the 1950s as the good life. Many intellectuals wrote about how the changes to American society were not good for America. One of them, John Keats, wrote this book, The Crack in the Picture Window, with comments like this. And really what he's writing about in this book is the loss of individuality that we see in the 1950s and the overwhelming obsession for material goods. Another author is David Reisman, who wrote The Lonely Crowd. And Reisman writes about how Americans used to be what he calls inner-directed. They did things like self-denial and frugality. Whereas during the 1950s, they become more other-directed and they become more consumers. And this leads to people changing their behavior to fit society. Basically, we see less individualism, and we see Americans during the 1950s becoming more sensitive to the expectation of others. Another book was written by William H. Weitz, who wrote this book, The Organization Man, with quotes like this, where he said that the Protestant work ethic and that personal responsibility that had been so important in American history had given way to a desire for belongingness. This leads to conformity and that loss of identity that the other authors were writing about. The group that takes these ideas to the extreme, this criticism of 1950s culture, is the Beats or the Beatniks. This is a literary group that is really rebelling against materialistic culture. And the most famous beatnik can be seen here.
Oh, man! Let's spill ink all over my poems. He's a real flat tire. I mean a cube, man. He's putting us on the train to Squaresville, Mona.
The Beats were known for long hair. They were known for wearing bizarre clothing, or at least clothing that looked bizarre in the 1950s. And they were also known for, by comparative standards, sexual promiscuity and more drug use than the average American. The most famous writer in the Beat movement is this guy, Jack Kerouac. Heard here.
There was a little alley in San Francisco, back of the Southern Pacific Station at 3rd and Townsend, in red brick of drowsy, lazy afternoons with everybody at work in offices. In the air you feel the impending rush of their commuter frenzy. As soon they'll be charging en masse from Market and Sansom buildings on foot and in buses, and all well-dressed through working man Frisco of walk-up truck drivers. And even the poor grime-bemarked 3rd Street of lost bums, even Negroes so hopeless and long left east, and meanings of responsibility and try, that now all they do is stand there spitting in the broken glass, sometimes 50 in one afternoon against one wall at 3rd and Howard. It is all these Millbrae and San Carlos neat necktied producers and commuters.
And that poem really illustrates the stream of consciousness style of writing that was popular with the Beats, where they would often drink lots of coffee and then sit down in front of the typewriter and just start typing everything that came into their head, sometimes without punctuation or very little punctuation like you heard there, and would just keep going. It's a very distinctive style of writing. The Beats were centered in San Francisco. They often hung out in bookstores and coffee houses, and the Beats are really going to be the foundation or the predecessor to the counterculture movement of the 1960s, what we often think of as hippies. In the visual art world, abstract expressionism became popular among critics of 1950s culture. So we see painters like Jackson Pollock really expressing individuality and a freedom from the realist movements that preceded it, with his paintings like this one here. People have often joked that anybody could do a Jackson Pollock painting. Not true. This one sold for a few $1 million. So he would splatter paint across the canvases spread across the floor. Very non-traditional approach to visual art.